The grand chandelier above the dining room cast a soft golden glow over the polished oak table, each place meticulously set, with china edged in gold and crystal glasses catching the light like tiny prisms. I smoothed the napkin at my place, inhaling the mingled scents of roast lamb, fresh herbs, and vanilla-scented candles, all arranged with Evangeline's signature precision. It was her 85th birthday, a milestone she had orchestrated with the same energy and flair she'd applied to every other event in her life. I watched her glide between guests, her pearls catching the light, her voice carrying just enough warmth to mask the undercurrent of control she wielded effortlessly. Amara tugged gently at my sleeve, her bright eyes sparkling with the curiosity only a 32-year-old can hold. "Mom," she whispered, with mock innocence, leaning close so only I could hear. "When will it be your turn?" I smiled, letting my lips curve just enough to mask the full weight of my amusement. It was a question I had heard in different forms, my entire adult life. A gentle nudge, a pointed comment, a subtle reminder that my achievements, my celebrations, my milestones were somehow always expected to measure up to Evangeline's standard, or worse, to be postponed until they were convenient for her gaze. I leaned down and kissed the top of Amara's head, her hair soft beneath my fingers, and replied with a quiet, almost conspiratorial tone. "It already happened. You just weren't there." Her eyebrows shot up, her mouth opening slightly in surprise, and I felt a small thrill course through me at the reaction. Around the table, subtle shifts caught my eye. Delphine's lips pressed tight together, eyes darting as if she'd just realized she'd been in the wrong room all her life. Evangeline's gaze flickered toward me, eyes narrowing imperceptibly before widening in shock. A few of the older relatives murmured amongst themselves, sensing the shift in energy, though none dared speak directly. I let the moment linger, letting my smile hold a quiet promise. There was power in a well-timed pause, in letting them feel the weight of the unspoken. For decades I had been the background figure, the one who smiled when they praised Delphine, the one who clapped politely when Evangeline's plans succeeded, the one whose presence seemed more obligatory than celebratory. I had watched my life unfold in parallel to theirs achievements, tucked neatly away where no one could see them, my triumphs mine alone. And now, in the middle of this elegant display, I had the opportunity to assert it silently before any words even left my lips. Amara glanced up at me, a mischievous spark still bright in her eyes, and I caught her gaze nodding slightly. She understood the subtle signal I was not about to perform for anyone tonight. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath, the clinking of silverware and the low murmur of polite conversation, faltering for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. I took a slow sip from my glass of Merlot, feeling the smooth warmth slide down my throat. Around me, glances darted, carefully measured, revealing undercurrents I had known all my life, but had rarely confronted directly. Evangeline's prideful smile faltered just a touch, the kind of imperceptible tremor only a mother with decades of expectation could exhibit when she realized she was not in full control. Delphine shifted in her seat, the faintest edge of envy sharpening her expression as she registered my calm certainty. The room, with all its polished surfaces and carefully orchestrated elegance, suddenly felt fragile, a delicate web ready to tremble under the right weight. I set my glass down slowly, deliberately, the faint clink echoing slightly louder than usual like a small declaration. For the first time, the room felt mine as much as theirs, a space not dictated solely by Evangeline's standards. And in that quiet, measured moment, I realized that tonight would be the beginning of more than a birthday celebration. It would be the first act of reclaiming everything I had quietly, meticulously preserved for myself over decades. And as the soft murmur of conversation resumed careful and cautious, I allowed my eyes to settle on Amara, seeing in her expression the same spark of understanding and resolve I felt within myself. From that first glance, the evening was no longer about tradition, no longer about appearances. It was about setting the record straight. And I knew the truth I carried would ripple through the room before it was even spoken. The next chapter would require more than subtle glances. It would demand honesty confrontation and the unflinching courage to claim my life as fully as I had lived it. The clink of silverware and soft murmur of polite conversation filled the room, but I could feel the subtle shifts in the air, almost like static electricity before a storm. A glance across the table caught Delphine tucking her hair behind one ear in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. It was a calculated gesture, a small assertion of superiority she thought would go unnoticed. Evangeline's eyes lingered on me longer than they should have, her smile still perfectly in place. Yet beneath it, there was the flicker of something unspoken, a question, a doubt, a measure of curiosity I had cultivated over years of careful observation. I let my gaze wander to the other relatives, noting micro-gestures everywhere, an uncle's raised eyebrow, a cousin's barely perceptible frown, a polite cough that seemed timed to interrupt my thoughts. The room was perfect on the surface, well-dressed, carefully arranged, a picture of harmony, but I could feel the undercurrents, the tension lurking beneath like a shadow waiting for daylight. These were the currents I had navigated all my life, yet tonight they were different. Tonight, I wasn't simply an observer. A flash of memory hit me sharply. My first job promotion, celebrated with colleagues, lauded in a newsletter I had copied family members on, but never received a single reply from them. I remembered the recital where Delphine's piano student was praised, and I sat quietly in the audience, unnoticed, my own achievement tucked neatly away in the recesses of my mind. Birthday parties, where gifts arrived late, poorly wrapped, or were left forgotten on the mantel. The countless times my voice had been smoothed over in family conversations, my opinions minimized or misheard. I had internalized it for decades, the small humiliations, the overlooked moments, until the habit of invisibility became second nature. Yet beneath the habit was something else: pride. Not arrogance, but an unshakable awareness of what I had accomplished, what I had endured, and how carefully I had preserved my own story. And alongside that pride was the aching desire for acknowledgement, for recognition that never came. It was a delicate tension I had carried silently, a balance between holding my dignity and longing for the validation I had long been denied. Amara's small hand brushed mine under the table, and the spark of her curiosity reminded me of the weight I had been carrying. She didn't need me to explain. She only needed to sense the significance. My smile remained calm, deliberate, but inside, I felt the stirrings of a truth that had been gathering momentum for years. The decades of being minimized, of playing the invisible role, had all led to this night, to this poised moment, where my silence itself became a kind of declaration. I let my eyes meet Evangeline's for the briefest instant, and I saw the flicker of unease there. She could feel it without understanding it, the subtle tension of someone who had been pushed aside for years, finally reclaiming her space. Delphine's shift in posture was equally telling, the minute straightening of her back, as if bracing for a confrontation she hadn't anticipated. I realized, not for the first time, that my family had perfected the illusion of control. Yet the smallest shift in timing or expression could unsettle the entire performance. I sipped my wine slowly, deliberately feeling the warmth spread and anchoring my awareness in the present. My thoughts returned to the long pattern of subtle slights, the small victories I had kept for myself, the ones I had carefully hidden to maintain peace. All of it had built this moment this evening, a quiet arena for revelation. And as I watched the room continue its polite chatter, I felt the first stirrings of momentum, the awareness that a truth long held in reserve was ready to be placed gently but firmly on the table, changing everything. Tonight, the balance had begun to shift, and the first move was mine. The next chapter would carry that momentum forward, transforming these glimmers of unease into the revelation that had been decades in the making. I remembered the gallery of my life in fragments, moments, stored in quiet corners of my mind where no one else had ever ventured. There was the promotion at the firm announced in a newsletter that I had sent to family with pride, and the silence that followed, as though my achievement had evaporated before it even reached them. I remembered the little apartment I had rented after leaving a suffocating first marriage, how I had painted the walls myself and filled the shelves with books and small treasures, only to have relatives glance at the photos I shared and comment on how much better Delphine's life seemed. Birthdays had always been a ritual of comparison. I could still see the tables, the perfect wrapping, the carefully curated guest lists. Delphine's presence was always celebrated with meticulous attention. Her smiles photographed her accomplishments praised, while my contributions and milestones faded into the background. Family photos told the story of a life in which I had been peripheral, a shadow in the corners of memory, present but unseen. Every time I flipped through those albums or scrolled through digital galleries, I felt the same quiet pang of being minimized, of being the daughter-in-law who was polite, capable, and yet always secondary. It wasn't that my life had lacked significance. It was that the significance had never been acknowledged by the people whose recognition mattered most. I had learned to carry it silently, cultivating independence as both armor and reward. I had watched Delphine receive attention for minor triumphs, while my own victories, big and small, were ignored. The contrast was subtle, cumulative, a tide of small erasures that over decades shaped me into someone careful with words and measured with gestures. I had become skilled at self-containment, at marking milestones quietly, almost invisibly, knowing that no one else would see them. And yet, beneath the careful exterior, there had always been a simmering awareness of my worth, a defiant insistence that my life was complete, valuable, and wholly mine. I had built a career that demanded skill and resolve, friendships that nourished without judgment, and a home that reflected my choices. I had traveled to cities and countries that fascinated me, explored interests and passions I had never been allowed to indulge in under the scrutiny of my in-laws' approval. Each decision, each success, was a small act of reclamation, a quiet insistence that I existed beyond the narratives imposed upon me. As I watched the room tonight, the carefully orchestrated celebration, I realized how much those old memories shaped my resolve. I had learned to hold myself accountable for my happiness, to measure my life by the standards I set, rather than those I was expected to meet. Delphine's smile, so practiced and precise now, seemed fragile and rehearsed in comparison to the life I had quietly constructed for myself. Every overlooked milestone, every unacknowledged triumph had been a lesson in autonomy, a foundation for the truth I was preparing to reveal. And as I lifted my glass to take another slow sip, I felt the weight of decades of invisibility shifting. The time had come to place that weight down, not with anger, but with the clarity and authority that had been building quietly all these years. The next chapter would move from reflection to revelation, turning these memories of oversight into the first tangible steps of disclosure. I let the memories settle like dust in sunlight, each one a quiet proof of the life I had built away from their watchful eyes. It had been decades since I allowed anyone to glimpse the full extent of my independence, my victories, the moments that mattered most to me. The twist, the culmination of years spent balancing silence with resolve, was simple yet profound. I had claimed my own life on my own terms, far from the glare of Evangeline's approval and Delphine's constant comparisons. Years ago, Dorian and I had made a decision that shocked no one more than the people around us might have expected. We had eloped quietly, deliberately, without fanfare, without the obligatory involvement of family who would have measured our happiness against a checklist of expectations. The ceremony had been nothing extravagant. A small courthouse on a crisp morning, the sky a steel blue, our hands entwined, our vows whispered just to each other. There had been no seating charts, no delicate napkins embroidered to match the grandeur of the bride's dress, no whispered critiques of table linens or floral arrangements. It was real, raw, unfiltered. I had mailed a single photograph afterward, a candid shot of me laughing in my simple dress, Dorian at my side, the wind-lifting strands of hair across our faces. The image captured more than just an event, it captured a declaration. One solitary, intimate testament to a life I had chosen for myself. And yet, as expected, it went unnoticed. No calls, no congratulations, no acknowledgement. Their indifference was another confirmation of what I had long suspected. I had never been the daughter-in-law they truly saw. I existed on the periphery, a background presence meant to blend, never to shine. That memory stirred something deep inside me tonight at Evangeline's birthday, as I observed the room of well-dressed relatives. I realized the power of this knowledge. It was mine alone. The elopement, the choice to protect myself from judgment, had been a triumph, not just over circumstance, but over decades of subtle erasure. It had been a quiet act of rebellion, a personal milestone so significant that revealing it now could ripple through the room in ways they would never anticipate. I sipped my wine, letting its warmth ground me, letting the energy of the room continue its polite murmur, while I prepared to release the first fragments of this long-held truth. My lips curved into a knowing smile, not out of arrogance, but because the moment had arrived when the weight of this secret could finally begin to shift the balance. All those small victories I had tucked away, the published essays, the business endeavors, the personal milestones were no longer invisible. They were mine to present carefully, deliberately, at a table that had never fully acknowledged me before. The air seemed to thicken as I prepared to speak the first words of a revelation, decades in the making, poised to land not with force, but with undeniable clarity. The next chapter would turn this private triumph into a visible disruption, as the family began to confront the reality they had long ignored. Amara leaned slightly toward me, her voice carrying just enough mischief to cut through the polite hum of conversation. "Mom," she said, tilting her head, "when will it be your turn?" I allowed the faintest curve of a smile to touch my lips, careful to let it linger just long enough to make the room sense its meaning without words. The smile was calm, cryptic, deliberate, a signal that what they assumed about me, about my life, was only half the truth. A small, invisible weight shifted in the air. I could feel it like a current threading through the room, pulling attention toward me, even as the conversation continued elsewhere. Evangeline's eyes flicked to mine almost immediately. For the first time that evening, the practiced calm of her expression faltered, however subtly. Her hands tightened around the stem of her wine-glass knuckles, blanching beneath delicate rings. Delphine shifted in her seat, adjusting her posture as if she needed to brace herself, and I caught the flash of unease that passed over her face. They both understood, without my saying a word, that this was no ordinary birthday remark. The room had been humming with polite chatter, laughter, tempered by the elegant constraints of formality. Now there was a tautness beneath it all, a quiet anticipation that threaded through glances and half-smiles. The energy was different, charged. My presence alone had begun to reshape the evening. I let the silence stretch just a fraction longer, letting the moment settle, letting the subtle unease become palpable. I reflected for a brief instant on the decades that had led to this evening. Years of polite invisibility, of being measured against Delphine's every move, of watching accomplishments minimized or overlooked entirely. How many birthdays had passed where my presence was acknowledged only by etiquette? How many celebrations had been curated to highlight others while my triumphs went unremarked, quietly tucked into corners of my memory? The years had taught me patience, taught me how to measure my response, to weigh the timing of each word, each smile. And now, finally, the timing was right. Amara's eyes met mine, wide and curious, and in that gaze I felt a current of understanding pass between us. She recognized in that simple question the spark that would ignite change, not in the tone of my voice, but in the truth it concealed. I allowed my smile to deepen ever so slightly, maintaining the calm surface while letting a trace of unspoken confidence ripple through the room. It was a quiet assertion, a statement that the narrative they had so carefully constructed around me was about to shift. Evangeline's lips parted slightly, as if she were inhaling a surprise she could not yet name, and Delphine's fingers tightened around her napkin. Even the younger relatives paused mid-conversation, sensing the subtle tremor in the air, though they could not articulate its source. I raised my glass in a casual, unassuming motion, letting the weight of decades of hidden decisions, accomplishments, and personal triumphs rest behind it. The room had noticed the shift. They had felt it. And I knew with a quiet certainty that the revelation that would follow would have consequences far beyond a single glance or whispered comment. And as the soft murmur of conversation resumed around us, I felt the momentum gather, preparing to carry the evening into a revelation that would leave no corner untouched, no pretense unchallenged. I let my glass rest in my hand for a heartbeat longer than necessary, letting the warmth of the wine anchor me as I prepared to speak. The room had already shifted, subtle currents of tension, weaving through polite chatter, drawing every eye toward me. I took a measured breath and began letting my words fall lightly, at first casual in tone, yet weighted with meaning. It's funny, I started glancing at Evangeline, who had frozen mid-smile. How life sometimes goes unnoticed, even when it is happening right under someone's nose. My voice was soft, conversational, but there was an edge to it that drew their attention, like gravity. Delphine's hand tightened around her fork, her knuckles blanching. I paused just long enough to let the unease settle before continuing. 6 months ago, I said, letting the words echo faintly against the high ceiling, Dorian and I quietly celebrated something very important to us. No one else was invited, and no one needed to be. I let a smile creep onto my face, knowing the implication would land before they could ask a single question. Evangeline's eyes widened imperceptibly, and Delphine's fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the napkin in her lap. A hush seemed to ripple across the table, the polite din of other conversations dampening as everyone processed what I had just said. I let it linger, watching their expressions, the subtle flicker of disbelief, the almost imperceptible darting of glances as they tried to reconcile what they thought they knew with this new information. It wasn't meant to be hidden. I continued tilting my head ever so slightly, letting the casual tone soften the edge of the revelation. It was meant to be protected from judgment, from comparisons, from the subtle ways our lives are constantly measured against someone else's story. It was private, because some things are too significant to be diluted by expectation. The tension at the table thickened. Evangeline's fingers tapped lightly against her wineglass, a nervous metronome marking the disruption of her perfect evening. Delphine's eyes flicked toward the younger cousins, then back to me, trying to anchor herself in the familiar patterns of family hierarchy, but finding them suddenly irrelevant. I could see the strain in their postures, the slight shifting of weight, as the room collectively recognized that I had done something entirely my own. I let my gaze sweep across the table, slowly taking in each face, without judgment, without malice, simply observation. This had been my secret for a reason, and now it was revealing itself in pieces carefully calibrated to assert control, without sparking a confrontation. I let a pause stretch, letting the weight of the unspoken fill the space between words. Their assumptions, their silent evaluations, their long-held impressions, all of it hovered in the air, waiting for the next piece to settle. "I've kept many moments private," I said quietly, not because they weren't significant, but because their significance didn't require acknowledgement from anyone else. My words hung in the air, deliberate and clear, a gentle assertion that for once the narrative was mine to command. Delphine's lips pressed together tighter now, while Evangeline's eyes seemed to search for something she could grasp, a way to reclaim control, but found nothing. I sipped my wine slowly, the simple act punctuating the weight of the revelation. In this moment, I could feel the balance of the room tilting the invisible power that had always belonged to them, subtly shifting toward me. The air was electric with anticipation, the faint tremor of disbelief threading through polite smiles and measured nods. And as I set my glass down with deliberate care, I sensed that the first real cracks in their assumptions had formed, and that the next step, revealing the full extent of what I had quietly achieved, would leave no one able to ignore the truth I had held for so long. I straightened in my chair, letting the faint tension in the room settle fully onto my shoulders, and spoke with the calm certainty I had cultivated over decades. "Dorian and I were married," I said, letting the words land deliberately. The sentence hung in the air for a heartbeat longer than necessary, letting them absorb it fully. It was a small, private ceremony, just us, the courthouse, a crisp morning, and vows we wrote ourselves. Evangeline's hand froze midway to her wineglass. Her pearls caught the light, but her smile faltered, a subtle quiver, betraying the shock she tried to hide. Delphine's fork clattered softly against her plate as she leaned back, her eyes widening in disbelief. The room filled with carefully rehearsed pleasantries, just moments before, seemed to constrict around us, every polite murmur now drowned beneath the weight of what I had revealed. I continued, letting the words spill slowly, deliberately. There was no lavish reception, no table linens arranged to perfection, no endless adjustments to satisfy anyone's idea of elegance. Just us, choosing to honor our love on our terms. I paused and let my gaze sweep across the table, letting the contrast sink in. This was my life, fully realized, lived without the permission or oversight of anyone who had long measured me by a standard I had never asked to meet. Delphine's lips pressed into a thin line. I could see the way her fingers fidgeted, the subtle flash of envy, masked beneath a veneer of polite shock. Evangeline's eyes were glassy, as if she were suddenly seeing me for the first time, confronted with a reality she had refused to acknowledge for decades. I let them sit in that space, absorbing the revelation, before adding quietly, "We sent one photograph afterward, just one. A candid moment of us laughing, real and unguarded." No one responded. The silence that followed was almost tangible. Their assumptions, their careful orchestration of perception, were crumbling. Evangeline opened her mouth, closed it again, searching for something that could reconcile my narrative with the version of life she had long imposed upon us. Delphine's eyes flicked down, unable to meet mine, as though by avoiding me, she could pretend I hadn't disrupted the story she had always relied upon. I let the moment breathe, savoring the quiet authority that came from years of invisible victories finally made visible. My life had unfolded outside their scrutiny, measured not by comparison, but by the values and choices I held dear. I had lived, achieved, and loved on my own terms, and for once the room was forced to reckon with the truth. I did it privately. I continued, voice steady, not because I had to hide, but because I needed to protect it from judgment, from subtle comparisons, from the kind of attention that diminishes rather than celebrates. It was ours, not theirs to witness. The words, soft yet firm, landed like stones in still water, rippling through the careful facade surrounding me. Evangeline's hand trembled as she adjusted her napkin, her pride momentarily unsettled. Delphine's jaw clenched, the smallest exhalation betraying her unease. Their perfect birthday, the glittering smiles, the rehearsed congratulations, all suddenly felt hollow against the reality of my authentic journey. I watched as the room struggled to reconcile what they had assumed about my life with what I had quietly, irrevocably made it to be. And in that suspended moment, I realized that decades of invisibility had finally begun to unravel, and the next step would extend the revelation beyond this quiet declaration, leaving no corner of expectation unchallenged. Evangeline's voice cut through the soft hum of the room, sharp and measured, though she tried to cloak it with a veneer of civility. "You should have told us," she said, her words deliberate, rehearsed even. Her gaze was fixed on me, seeking a flicker of guilt or hesitation that might allow her to reclaim some semblance of control over the evening. I lifted my chin, keeping my tone calm, deliberate, and free of any defensiveness. "I didn't tell you because it wasn't necessary," I replied evenly. "It was ours, private and intentional. It had nothing to do with approval or acknowledgement from anyone here." My words landed softly, but with enough weight to leave no room for immediate argument. Delphine shifted in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her legs, her movements betraying discomfort. "You always make things about you," she murmured under her breath, though loud enough for me to catch it. She tried to disguise it as concern, but the undertone of reproach was unmistakable. I let it wash over me without reaction, letting the quiet authority in my posture speak louder than any words I could offer. Dorian, ever steady, placed a hand lightly on mine beneath the table. The small gesture anchored me, a silent reminder that I was not navigating this alone. He met my gaze and offered nothing but reassurance, a quiet support that contrasted sharply with the flustered attempts of others to regain composure. The room seemed to hold its breath, uncertain of where to turn next. Evangeline's hand trembled slightly as she adjusted her napkin, a faint display of unease beneath her cultivated poise. "As your mother, I had a right to be there." She continued, her voice gaining just enough tension to pierce the polite atmosphere. "We would have wanted to celebrate with you, to witness it. This should have been shared." I tilted my head, letting my eyes meet hers without a hint of apology. "You didn't ask," I said simply. "No one did. You assumed, as you always do, that my life would revolve around your expectations, that my achievements needed your validation to exist." The words were calm, precise, and undeniable, each syllable measured to assert the reality that had been ignored for decades. Delphine's fork tapped lightly against her plate, a subtle, almost instinctive attempt to assert her presence, to reclaim a narrative she had always assumed belonged to her. Others murmured, uneasy, unsure of how to navigate the shift in power that my revelation had created. Every glance and gesture seemed weighted with unspoken comparison, subtle jabs at one another, each reflecting the decades of expectation and hierarchy that had dominated this family. I let them struggle in that tension, allowing them to experience for the first time the discomfort of their assumptions being challenged. My voice remained steady. This wasn't meant to hurt anyone, I said, but it was necessary for me to claim what is mine and to step into a life that I have built entirely on my own terms. The room's polite hum faltered the air thick with the quiet acknowledgement that no defense or justification could undo the truth I had revealed. Evangeline's shoulders tightened, Delphine's expression faltered, and the subtle micro-conflicts that had long simmered beneath the surface came into sharp, undeniable focus. And in that charged stillness, I knew that the momentum I had begun, the slow, deliberate unraveling of expectation, would carry the evening forward, guiding the family toward a confrontation with reality that could no longer be ignored. I let my gaze drift across the table, watching the subtle ways my family tried to regain control, and I felt the weight of decades settle over me like a familiar, heavy shawl. The polite tension in the room reminded me of the countless times I had been minimized, ignored, or quietly erased over the years. I could see it all again, as if it were happening in slow-motion birthdays I had attended where Delphine was showered with praise, while my own small achievements went unnoticed. Anniversaries, where my presence was acknowledged only with a polite nod, never a moment of real celebration. I remembered the recitals, the graduations, the quiet evenings where I had brought home certificates, awards, or letters of recognition, and watched as attention shifted elsewhere. Delphine's accomplishments had always been elevated, highlighted, photographed, while mine were filed away in folders tucked into drawers fading into the background. Even at family dinners, my suggestions or stories were met with polite acknowledgement, then quickly redirected to someone else, someone who mattered more to them. It wasn't just the events, it was the pattern, the consistency of it. Every subtle comparison, every casual comment about how Delphine does things right, or how she always knows the proper way, etched into my memory, a slow accumulation of diminishment that spanned decades. I had learned to navigate it, to smile, to nod, to cultivate independence quietly, all while harboring a simmering awareness of my own worth and the life I had built outside their constant scrutiny. Even the smallest moments stung. A photograph where I was cropped to the edge, a holiday card that arrived after everyone else had been praised for their participation, a congratulatory call that never came. Each instance was a reminder that I existed primarily as an accessory, a reflection of someone else's story rather than the protagonist of my own. I had carried these memories silently, folding them into my life like delicate papers, preserving my dignity while hiding the ache of being unseen. And yet, through it all, I had grown resilient. I had cultivated a life that mattered on its own terms, not defined by the approval or acknowledgement of those who could not see me. My achievements, my choices, my milestones, they had been my own. I had built a career that demanded skill and resolve, friendships that nurtured without judgment, and a home that reflected the life I wanted rather than the life they imagined for me. As I sat there now, the quiet weight of those years pressed into the moment, giving my next words gravity. This was the culmination of decades of observation, of patience, of careful preparation. Every slight, every overlooked triumph, every moment of quiet dismissal had led to this evening. I was no longer the background figure, the invisible daughter-in-law, the one whose presence was politely tolerated. I was present in full, and the room could feel it. I allowed my gaze to meet Evangeline's for just a heartbeat, and then Delphine's, letting the silence speak volumes where words could not. The history was clear. The accumulation of neglect and marginalization was undeniable. And now, with the momentum I had gathered, it was time to turn those memories into the catalyst for revelation, to move from the shadows into the light that was fully, unequivocally mine. The next chapter would be about standing fully in that light, confronting the family with the reality they had long ignored, and asserting the authority I had earned over a lifetime of being overlooked. I took a slow breath and let my eyes settle firmly on Evangeline, then Delphine, making sure each of them understood I was present, not just physically, but fully intentionally and unyieldingly. I've stayed silent for too long. I said, my voice calm, measured, but carrying a weight they couldn't ignore. I've allowed assumptions, comparisons, and your versions of perfection to define how I participated in this family. That ends tonight. Evangeline's fingers tightened around her wine glass. Her practiced smile faltered for the first time this evening, just enough to betray the unease beneath her composure. Delphine's jaw tightened, the faint tremor of her hands betraying the effort it took to maintain a semblance of normalcy. Both of them had spent decades assuming that silence could contain me, that polite nods and measured phrases could limit my presence to a background role. They had miscalculated. I'm not here to fight or to hurt anyone. I continued, my tone steady. I'm here to set the record straight. All those times I was minimized, ignored, or made to feel invisible, they're part of our history. I've carried them with me quietly because that's what was expected, but I won't carry them any longer. Evangeline's mouth opened slightly, a hesitation that spoke louder than any words. She tried to construct a rebuttal, a justification, but the pause between us stretched and filled the room with the weight of all the years she had taken my presence for granted. Delphine shifted in her seat, subtly aligning herself closer to her mother, as if proximity could lend her authority she had never earned. I let them flounder for a moment, letting the truth of my words sink into the space they had always believed they controlled. You've defined me by your standards, by your expectations, by the measure of Delphine's accomplishments compared to mine. I said, each word deliberate, each phrase weighted with decades of suppressed frustration and quiet observation. You've dictated what is worthy of recognition, whose successes are celebrated, whose milestones matter. And through it all, I stood in the shadows, smiling, nodding, and waiting for permission to exist fully in my own life. Delphine's fork rattled against her plate, as if she needed to remind herself that she still held some semblance of control. I ignored it, letting the sound fade into the background, much like their attempts to diminish me had faded over the years. I am done with that, I said, letting the words resonate clearly. I will no longer be the silent witness to your versions of reality. I will no longer allow my life to be measured against the reflections of your priorities. I exist on my own terms, and it is time you acknowledge that. Evangeline opened her mouth again, her voice soft but sharp with restrained authority. But she began only to stop herself mid-sentence. Realizing that her arguments had no ground, that the years of subtle control could not override the decades of autonomy I had quietly built. I let the room absorb the weight of my statement. My gaze swept slowly across the assembled family, capturing the flickers of discomfort, the micro shifts in posture, the subtle recalibration of authority that they had not anticipated. For years, I had been the background figure, the one whose presence was polite, necessary, but invisible. Tonight I had claimed the center quietly, firmly, irrevocably. And as the murmurs of the room continued in a strained hush, I knew the next step would be to demonstrate the extent of my life beyond their control, to show them fully the scope of what they had ignored for decades, and to ensure that my narrative could no longer be dismissed or rewritten. The room held its breath. The polite hum of conversation had evaporated, leaving a tense stillness that pressed against every wall. I didn't need to speak. My words had already shifted the balance, and now the silence carried authority. Each glance, each measured pause, every subtle gesture created a rhythm that neither Evangeline nor Delphine could disrupt. The shift was unmistakable, and it was mine to hold. Evangeline's eyes flickered with disbelief, searching for a foothold she could no longer claim. There was none. Every gesture she made was countered by my composure, honed over decades of careful observation and silent endurance. Delphine's subtle movements betrayed her tension, straightening, slumping, flexing fingers against the napkin. Tiny signs of someone accustomed to control, confronted with autonomy she could not command. I did not interrupt. I let the room feel the weight of what had been denied me for years. I sipped my wine slowly, letting its warmth anchor me. The polished table, the crystal glasses, the meticulously curated celebration, once reflections of their expectations, now served as a stage for mine. The silence amplified the authority I had cultivated over decades' quiet power, born of patience, resilience, and self-possession. My gaze traveled across the table. Some faces were frozen, unsure how to navigate this subtle shift. Others cast furtive glances at each other, searching for reassurance or instruction. None found it. I had become the fulcrum, the center around which the evening rotated. Their assumptions, their judgments, their influence all had no purchase here. I existed fully, not a shadow, not a footnote, but undeniably present. Memories of overlooked achievements and quiet milestones fueled my calm authority. Every unacknowledged triumph, every invisible act of independence resonated through the room now. Evangeline's hand shifted. Delphine's foot tapped, but neither could break the rhythm I had established. My composure carried the weight of decades, and in that quiet assertion, they were powerless. The tension stretched taut, a wordless acknowledgement that influence could no longer claim me. Authority could not be challenged by expectation or hierarchy. I set my glass down deliberately, letting the stillness settle. The next revelation, the full extent of my life beyond their control, was poised to unfold, leaving nothing for them to dismiss. I rose slowly from my seat, letting the movement draw the room's attention without a word. All eyes followed uncertain, sensing a shift in the rhythm that had held the evening together. I carried nothing in my hands, yet the weight of what I intended was heavier than any object I could place on the table. The family album, long kept as a symbol of their version of perfection, sat in a corner of my home, filled with curated images that reflected their narrative of who I was supposed to be. Tonight, I would return it, not angrily, not with accusation, but with the quiet authority of someone reclaiming what had always been hers to define. I reached for my purse beneath the table and withdrew a small cream-colored envelope. I had written nothing elaborate, no long explanations, no blame, no justification, only a single word carefully chosen: return. The simplicity carried everything I needed it to. I placed the envelope in front of Evangeline, letting my hand linger just long enough for her to sense the intention behind it. The subtle weight of decades of silent achievement, of careful self-protection, rested there in a single gesture. Evangeline blinked. Her mouth opened, then closed again, as if forming the words she could not say. Delphine's fork clattered against her plate, an involuntary noise breaking the tension, but it was quickly swallowed by the charged silence. I let it be, allowing their unease to unfold, naturally, unmanipulated, unscripted. This was not about punishment, nor was it about spectacle. This was about asserting ownership of a life that had been minimized for far too long. I leaned back in my chair, calm and deliberate, and allowed my eyes to sweep across the table. Every glance carried meaning. Every small movement of mine radiated control over my own narrative. The room was no longer mine to observe quietly. It was now mine to influence subtly, firmly, without malice, without haste. They could see it, even if they could not fully grasp it. Yet I was the author of my story, and every element of their polished expectations had been for decades secondary to the life I had quietly built. I spoke softly, carefully, letting the words settle among the murmurs of anticipation. This has always been about more than photos, more than appearances. I said, not directing blame, but stating a simple truth. It has been about acknowledging that a life can be complete, meaningful, and authentic, even if it is not reflected in someone else's story. My tone was steady, unwavering, and yet it carried a resonance they could feel, like a pulse running beneath the surface of their carefully controlled environment. The subtle tremor in Evangeline's hands, the slight hesitation in Delphine's posture, the way their eyes flicked toward one another and back to me. These were all confirmations of what I already knew. I had spent years constructing a life that belonged to me alone, and now the space I had created, the life I had chosen to live quietly, was finally visible in a way they could no longer ignore. Every carefully hidden triumph, every personal milestone, every choice made without their approval, now existed as undeniable proof of my agency. I allowed the silence to linger for a moment longer, letting the room absorb what it could. Then, with the smallest of gestures, I pushed the envelope slightly forward, a quiet invitation for them to recognize that the story they had controlled was no longer theirs to shape. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the warmth settle in, anchoring me, as the currents of anticipation swirled through the room. And as I let my gaze settle on Amara, seeing the quiet understanding in her expression, I knew the momentum of the evening had shifted irrevocably. This symbolic act had done more than disrupt the curated image of our family. It had established a precedent, a subtle yet unmistakable declaration that I was no longer a passive participant. My narrative, once erased and minimized, was now firmly in my hands. The next chapter would take this momentum further, transforming the revelation and assertion of control into a celebration of authenticity, where the life I had quietly built would finally be honored on my own terms. The next evening, Dorian and I stood in our small backyard, the string lights casting a soft glow over the few folding chairs we had arranged in a semicircle. It wasn't a grand celebration, not by any measure of perfection or expectation, and that was precisely the point. I glanced at him and caught the subtle curve of his smile, the way his eyes mirrored my quiet relief. For once, the world felt like it belonged to us, entirely ours, without the weight of expectation pressing from every side. Friends who had known me for decades arrived first, each bringing a small dish or a bottle of wine, a simple gesture of connection. They didn't need to impress. They came to share in the authenticity of the moment, not in a carefully curated performance. Our daughter Amara moved among them with easy laughter, her presence a bridge between generations, carrying the innocence and honesty that only someone who truly sees you can provide. I took a deep breath, letting the evening settle around me, feeling the absence of the usual scrutiny, as liberating as the night air itself. No one here questioned my choices or measured my accomplishments against a hidden standard. There were no veiled comparisons, no whispered critiques of etiquette or taste. Just presence, simple and unadorned, and that presence was more than enough. Dorian took my hand and led me to the center of our small gathering. "You want to say a few words?" he asked gently, his voice warm, steady. I nodded, smiling at him, and took a breath. I've spent a long time watching, waiting, and measuring myself against others' expectations. I began letting the cadence of my words fall naturally, carrying the gravity of years unspoken. Tonight is about embracing what is real, what is ours, and what we choose to celebrate on our terms. The faces in front of me, lit softly by the overhead lights, were attentive, but relaxed, unburdened by the usual dynamics that had dominated so much of my life. They nodded, some with quiet smiles, some with tears glimmering at the corners of their eyes. For the first time in decades, I felt the unspoken validation that mattered, the acknowledgement of a life lived intentionally, fully and honestly. We shared stories, old and new laughter, threading through the small space with a rhythm that was unforced, a melody composed entirely of truth. Dorian toasted our friends quietly, highlighting each contribution without exaggeration, and I felt the subtle comfort of being seen without the distortion of expectation. This celebration was not about grandeur or approval or performance. It was about recognition in its purest form, acknowledgement without judgment, joy without comparison. Amara bounded over to me, her laughter ringing through the yard. "This is perfect, Mom," she said, eyes shining. I smiled and kissed the top of her head, feeling a warmth that was entirely self-contained, not contingent on anyone else's approval. She had inherited none of the weight of history that I had carried. She could see the moment for what it truly was, a celebration of life as it had been lived, not as it had been imagined for me. As the evening stretched on, I watched the small group interact, noticing the ease of connection, the absence of pretense, the authenticity in every gesture. I realized that this simplicity, this honesty, was the antidote to decades of feeling invisible. The joy was real because it was unmeasured, uncalculated, and unclaimed by anyone but ourselves. Dorian slipped his hand into mine again, squeezing gently. "You've built something that no one can take away," he said quietly. I nodded, letting the truth of it settle into me, the quiet satisfaction of knowing that we had created a space entirely our own. And as the soft laughter continued to weave through the night, I understood that the next chapter would be about solidifying boundaries, ensuring that the authenticity we had created here remained untouchable, even in the face of those who had long tried to define our lives for us. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with Dorian, a steaming cup of coffee warming my hands, and thought through the conversations that had loomed all evening. The celebration had been perfect in its simplicity, but I knew that the echoes of the previous night's revelations would not fade without confrontation. It was time to establish limits, not with anger, but with clarity and calm. Evangeline called mid-morning, her voice polite but edged with expectation. "Sarah, I think we need to discuss last night," she said, the words threaded with the subtle insistence of someone used to control. Delphine lingered on the line behind her, a faint rustle audible as she waited to interject, as if proximity would lend her authority she no longer held. I listened carefully, letting their words settle without interruption, gauging the intention beneath the civility. I let a measured pause stretch before responding. "I understand that last night was difficult for you to process," I said evenly. But the evening was never about diminishing anyone. It was about celebrating life as Dorian and I have chosen to live it. That choice includes establishing boundaries that protect our peace and our family from the same patterns of judgment and comparison that have dominated for decades. Evangeline's exhale carried a tension she could not hide. "But we are family. We have a right to participate, to know what is happening in your lives," she said. Delphine added, her tone sharper now. "We only want to maintain the traditions that hold our family together." I let their insistence hang in the air, knowing it was a rehearsal of authority I had heard countless times before. Family is not defined by oversight or approval. I replied, calm but resolute. It is defined by respect, care, and the acknowledgement of individual autonomy. Dorian and I are responsible for our lives, our celebrations, and the space we create for Amara. That space is not up for negotiation. There was a long silence on the line. I could hear Evangeline's subtle shift, the tiny adjustments of posture she made, even over the phone, a gesture of someone realizing that control had slipped. Delphine's quiet breath indicated she too understood that the dynamic had changed. I did not soften my tone, and I did not waver. Years of acquiescence had led only to invisibility. Firmness now ensured recognition and respect without conflict. I am not asking for approval, I continued. I am informing you of boundaries that will remain in place. They are not negotiable because they are essential to our family's health and our peace of mind. Participation will be welcome only when it aligns with respect for those boundaries. Evangeline's voice faltered slightly, as if testing for concession, but she found none. Delphine's interjection never came replaced by a tense pause that said more than any argument could. The quiet authority in my words carried a clarity they could not manipulate a truth that had been too long denied. I ended the call with a deliberate calm, letting the weight of the conversation settle. Dorian reached across the table and squeezed my hand. His quiet support, a reminder that the life we had built could withstand these challenges. I knew there would be resistance moments of subtle testing, but the boundaries had been established, defined not by anger, but by deliberate, unwavering clarity. And as the silence lingered after the call, I felt the shift settle fully. The next step would be to reflect on these years to solidify the lessons learned and to chart the path toward healing that had been decades in the making. I sat in the quiet of our living room that evening, the soft hum of the city drifting through the open windows, and let the events of the past week settle around me. For decades, I had carried the weight of expectations that were never mine to bear, measured against standards set by Evangeline and reinforced by Delphine. Each overlooked milestone, each subtle act of exclusion, had etched itself into my memory, shaping my responses and my choices. But now, after the revelations and the small celebration Dorian and I had hosted, the air felt lighter, the years of invisible burden easing with each deliberate breath I took. I reflected on the life I had built quietly, steadfastly outside the scrutiny that had defined so many of my early years. My career, my personal triumphs. The milestones Amara had witnessed, these were not framed by comparison or approval, but by the values I had chosen to embrace. Each moment of independence, each decision to protect my own joy, had been an assertion of self-worth I had long been denied. I realized how much resilience I had cultivated, how many lessons I had absorbed about patience, observation, and the quiet power of owning one's life. Amara wandered into the room, her laughter spilling into the quiet like sunlight across the floor. She looked up at me with the ease of someone who had always known herself to be valued, not measured. I smiled, kneeling to meet her gaze. "You don't need anyone else to tell you who you are?" I said softly. She nodded, understanding more than words could capture. In raising her, I had poured into her the lessons I had learned the hard way: self-respect, autonomy, and the courage to define one's own path without seeking permission from those who might never truly see you. I thought about the boundaries I had set with Evangeline and Delphine, and the subtle shifts I had observed in them, the recognition that my voice, my choices, and my life were no longer subject to their control. The calm authority I had established, combined with the symbolic acts of claiming my narrative, had begun to reshape the dynamic in ways that were long overdue. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not in revenge or defiance, but in the simple acknowledgement that I could exist fully honestly and with integrity, regardless of whether they understood or approved. The memories of overlooked birthdays, ignored achievements, and silenced opinions no longer carried the same sting. Instead, they served as markers of growth, proof that I had endured, adapted, and ultimately thrived. I realized that fulfillment did not require validation from anyone but myself, that my life had meaning and beauty independent of familial recognition. The quiet joy of knowing I had lived authentically, and that Amara could witness it, was more powerful than any applause or acknowledgement I had once longed for. Dorian joined me. settling beside me on the couch with a gentle squeeze of my hand. "You've come far," he said quietly, his eyes warm with shared understanding. "Not everyone finds their peace with so much history to overcome." I nodded, allowing the truth of that to settle fully into me. The weight of expectation, the years of invisibility, and the subtle pressures of family judgment had finally lost their hold. I leaned back, letting the night enfold us, and felt a deep, abiding sense of completion. The lessons of the past, the victories both quiet and profound, had culminated in this clarity that life, when lived on one's own terms, carries a fulfillment that no external approval can replicate. And as I looked toward tomorrow, I knew the next step would be moving forward fully into this autonomy building, the future I had long envisioned, and embracing the freedom I had so deliberately claimed. The following week settled into a rhythm I hadn't known for decades. The quiet mornings with Dorian, the laughter of Amara echoing through the house, and the steady hum of my work provided a structure that felt both grounding and liberating. I moved through each day with an ease that had once seemed impossible, aware of the freedom I had carved out for myself. Every choice I made now reflected my priorities, my values, and the life I had long imagined for myself, authentic, deliberate, and unshackled from the expectations that had once constrained me. I returned to my projects with renewed focus. Long neglected professional goals were now pursued with a sense of clarity and confidence I had not allowed myself to feel before. Meetings, deadlines, and collaborations were no longer instruments of external validation, but opportunities to apply my skills, judgment, and creativity on my own terms. I felt the steady satisfaction of competence without the need for applause, the subtle pleasure of progress measured against my own standards rather than anyone else's. Friendships, too, took on a new dimension. Those who had always respected my autonomy were now companions in full presence, unburdened by the unspoken dynamics that had colored my interactions with so many others. Conversations flowed freely, punctuated with laughter and honesty. No one questioned my choices. No one sought to measure or compare. For the first time, I was able to exist within a network of support that neither demanded conformity nor imposed judgment, and the experience was quietly exhilarating. Amara thrived in this environment. I watched her navigate her own life with the lessons she had absorbed, the lessons of self-respect, personal agency, and courage. She approached challenges with a sense of ownership I had once only dreamed of, and I felt a deep pride in knowing that my journey, my reclamation of voice and autonomy, had paved the way for her confidence. Each moment I shared with her reminded me that empowerment was not a solitary achievement, but one that could ripple outward, influencing those we loved most. Interactions with Evangeline and Delphine continued, but they had shifted markedly. The small gestures of control they once relied upon, the critiques, the subtle manipulations, the comparisons had lost their efficacy. They tested occasionally, but the boundaries I had established remained firm. Their influence had diminished not through conflict, but through the quiet, persistent assertion of my authority. The demonstration that my life, my choices, and my happiness were no longer negotiable. I had created a space in which they could exist without dictating my experience, and the relief of that independence was profound. Evenings were filled with the simple pleasures that had long been denied to me. Walks with Dorian, evenings spent reading with Amara at my side, dinners shared with friends who valued authenticity over spectacle. The weight of expectation, of judgment, of maintaining appearances had lifted. I was fully present in each moment, savoring it without the constant undercurrent of comparison or critique. As the days stretched into weeks, I realized that this integration of authentic living, career, friendships, and family was more than a restoration. It was a transformation. I had moved from reaction to agency, from invisibility to presence, from constraint to freedom. Every decision, every choice, every deliberate act of self-determination reinforced the truth. I had claimed my life was mine to shape, and its value was inherent, not contingent on recognition from others. And as I closed my laptop one evening and watched Amara settle into her reading, I felt the steady pulse of contentment and clarity. The next chapter of my life would be defined not by the shadows of expectation, but by the deliberate, confident steps I took forward, fully embracing the life I had earned and the autonomy I had long sought. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of quiet assurance, a life I had longed for, but had never fully allowed myself to claim. The tension with Evangeline and Delphine had softened, though not entirely disappeared. Their gestures now carried an edge of recognition rather than authority. I noticed it in fleeting glances, in the way they measured their words, aware that the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. I carried no resentment, only a steady clarity that the bonds of family were not defined by control or expectation, but by genuine care and respect. Amara thrived in this space, her laughter and curiosity a constant reminder of the lessons she had absorbed. She saw that strength did not always announce itself loudly. It could be quiet, deliberate, and consistent. Watching her navigate her own life with that understanding filled me with a pride that was deeper than any acknowledgement I had ever sought from my in-laws. She understood without instruction that self-worth was inherent, not conditional, and that the power to define one's life was not given, but claimed. Dorian, ever steady, remained my anchor. His quiet support reinforcing the truth that partnership was about shared respect, not oversight. He celebrated the small victories with me, laughed at the moments that once would have been overshadowed by comparison, and reminded me without words that the life we had built together was ours alone. It was in these shared moments, ordinary yet profound, that I felt the depth of our autonomy, the richness of a life lived intentionally. I thought often of the years I had spent navigating their expectations, measuring my words, my choices, my accomplishments against invisible standards. The moments when I had been minimized, overlooked, or quietly excluded now felt like markers of growth rather than wounds. Each one had taught me patience, resilience, and the value of claiming my narrative. The boundaries I had set, the symbolic acts of asserting ownership, and the quiet celebrations of authenticity had built a life where approval was optional and integrity was paramount. Family, I realized, could never be defined by appearance or ritual alone. It was not the birthday parties, the photo albums, or the carefully arranged events that measured its truth. Family was reflected in care, in acknowledgement without judgment, and in the willingness to let one another exist fully without imposing control. That clarity reshaped not only my relationship with them, but my understanding of myself. I was no longer seeking permission to occupy space or to celebrate life. I was living it fully, freely, and unapologetically. And so, as I watched Amara settle into her evening routine, Dorian beside me with the quiet contentment that always accompanied his presence, I felt a sense of completion that was neither boastful nor fleeting. It was the calm knowledge that life, when lived authentically, carries its own validation. I had endured, reclaimed, and built a legacy not of appearances, but of truth and self-determination. The story of these years, the reclamation of voice and agency, was now ours entirely. And as the evening stretched toward night, I understood that the lessons we carried forward, independence, integrity, and love, defined by care rather than expectation, would shape not only our lives, but the lives of those who followed quietly and profoundly in our footsteps.